So I did my presentation on the Korean War. Some overview about the Korean War is that it started on June 25th, 1950 and ended July 27th, 1953. It was fought between North Korea, also the Chinese halfway through the war, and the United States with South Korea and the UN. Over 3 million people died in the Korean War, and it was one of the only wars to have no definite conclusion or verdict. It is often called the Forgotten War because it was between World War II and Vietnam, so it is overlooked a lot. The main reason to fight was because they didn't want communism to spread. So how the Korean War happened was that World War II made it so that the northern half of Korea was communist and the southern half was occupied by America and wasn't communist. It began when North Korea crossed the 38th parallel, and the 38th parallel is what divides South and North Korea, and North Korea invaded South Korea on June 25th, 1950. President Truman said that North Korea attacked South Korea by orders of the Soviet Union. Kim Il-sung, the leader of North Korea at the time, had his army invade with Soviet tanks and powerful weaponry, and the North Korean army pushed the South Korean army to the city of Busan, in which the South Korean army was almost defeated, so they needed the US to rescue them. President Truman said, "The attack upon Korea makes it plain beyond all doubt that communism has passed beyond the use of subversion to conquer independent nations and will now use armed invasion and war." So talking about the NSC-68, 2 months prior to the invasion, the U.S. National Security Council, or the NSC-68, had proposed more U.S. military spending so that the U.S. can enforce its containment policy. Congress ignored their recommendation, and President Truman relooked at their proposal and called for a 350% increase in military spending. The U.S. also made a UN Security Council proposal that condemned North Korea and their aggression. All 9 voting nations made a resolution. However, the Soviet representative was absent the day of voting. This resolution is what gave Truman the ability to use military force without actively starting a war. So a little bit about what happened in the Korean War. The U.S. General Douglas MacArthur arranged an attack on Incheon, a city on the west coast of Korea. MacArthur and his troops crushed the North Korean army and took back Seoul. General MacArthur wasn't satisfied with just Seoul, so he crossed the 38th parallel with his troops to the most northern part of North Korea. China was afraid that the U.S. wanted to use North Korea as a base against Manchuria, so they sent troops to attack the U.S. and UN troops at the Yalu River. Chinese told the U.S. not to cross the border along the Yalu River, but General MacArthur ignored this, and this is a part of what led him to being fired. President Truman wanted to make peace to avoid starting a war, but General MacArthur disagreed with this and argued to fight China by bombing China. President Truman was worried that the Soviets would also join and retaliate in Europe and other areas of Asia. President Truman and the UN told MacArthur no attacks in China and no nuclear weapons were allowed. But General MacArthur expressed his concerns about disagreement with the president, which caused peace negotiations to come to a halt, which ultimately made the war 2 years longer. And General MacArthur was fired because of criticizing Truman and delaying the peace negotiations. And although in the public, General MacArthur was thought of as a war hero, and President Truman was seen as weak and a communist sympathizer. So a little bit about the aftermath of the Korean War. The fighting in Korea was very draining on America. The lack of goals and plan to victory discouraged the American people from supporting American involvement in the Korean War. Since Truman became so unpopular with the American people, he decided not to run for re-election in 1952, and General Dwight D. Eisenhower promised an end to the Korean War, which American people wanted. So Dwight D. Eisenhower was elected in 1952 and went to Korea to work on peace talks immediately. and negotiations were difficult as when President Truman was president, but it wasn't until President Eisenhower threatened to use atomic weapons that negotiations advanced, and then a sudden ceasefire between North and South Korea was signed on July 27, 1953. This truce restored the 38th parallel boundary and established a demilitarized zone, also known as the DMZ. However, Americans still weren't satisfied with the result, since 37,000 American soldiers lost their lives and 100,000 were injured. All in all, Americans felt the Korean War was pointless and an unclear victory. However, one positive is that the spread of communism stopped from spreading to the south of Korea.